Thomas Mitchell sat quietly in the corner of Riverside Cafe on a cold Tuesday morning. The winter wind rattled the windows as early commuters hurried past on the street outside. Thomas pulled his thin coat tighter round his shoulders and carefully placed his worn leather wallet on the small wooden table. His weathered hands, marked with age spots and old scars, trembled slightly as he counted the coins and crumpled notes inside. Each penny mattered now. The 78-year-old veteran wore his old army cap, faded green but still clean and pressed. On his jacket, small military pins caught the morning light, medals that told stories of a younger man's courage in places far from home. The cafe was busy with the morning rush. Business people in smart suits ordered expensive coffee drinks. While checking their phones, students with laptops claimed corner tables for study sessions. The warm smell of fresh bread and bacon filled the air, making Thomas's empty stomach ache with hunger. He had been coming to this cafe every Tuesday morning for the past 3 years. It was the same day he used to bring his beloved wife Margaret here for their weekly breakfast date. She would order scrambled eggs and always steal a bite of his toast, laughing when he pretended to be annoyed. Those memories felt like a lifetime ago now. Thomas counted his money again, more slowly this time. 1 pound coin, another pound coin, 50 pence, 20 pence, a handful of smaller coins that barely added up to anything meaningful. His pension had been stretched thin this month after paying for his heart medication and the gas bill for his small flat. "Next, please," called the young man behind the counter. He looked about 20 years old with kind eyes and a friendly smile. That reminded Thomas of his grandson who lived too far away to visit. Thomas shuffled forward in the queue, his old shoes making soft sounds on the tiled floor. The businessman behind him tapped his foot impatiently, already speaking loudly into his mobile phone about some important meeting. Thomas tried to make himself smaller, aware that he was moving slower than everyone else seemed to expect. "Good morning, sir. What can I get for you today?" the server asked politely. "Just tea and 1 slice of toast, please," Thomas said quietly, his voice barely carrying over the noise of the busy cafe. It was the cheapest thing on the menu, but it would be enough. Margaret always said that simple pleasures were often the best ones. "That'll be for £1.50, the young man said, pressing buttons on the till that made electronic beeping sounds. Thomas felt his heart sink. £4.50. He had counted carefully, but somehow he had miscalculated. His shaking hands moved through the coins again, hoping he had missed something. £1, £2, £3, £4.20. He was 30 pence short. The queue behind him was growing longer. People were starting to shift their weight from foot to foot, checking their watches and looking round with growing impatience. Thomas could feel the heat rising in his cheeks as embarrassment washed over him like a cold wave. "I'm sorry, lad," Thomas whispered, his voice catching slightly. "I seem to be a bit short today." The businessman directly behind him huffed loudly, making no effort to hide his annoyance. He wore an expensive suit and carried a leather briefcase that probably cost more than Thomas spent on food in a month. Some people shouldn't come out if they can't afford to pay. The businessman muttered, checking his gold watch with exaggerated frustration. "This is ridiculous. I have an important meeting to get to." The words hit Thomas like physical blows. Every person in the cafe seemed to turn and stare at him. Conversation stopped. Coffee cups paused halfway to lips. Thomas felt every eye in the room watching him, judging him, seeing him as nothing more than an inconvenience. His proud shoulders, which had once stood straight in military uniform while marching with his regiment, now curved inward with shame. This was not how a soldier should be seen. This was not the dignity he had tried to maintain since Margaret's death 6 months ago. Thomas looked down at his hands and saw his wedding ring, a simple gold band that Margaret had, placed on his finger 52 years ago. It was the last precious thing he owned, the final connection to the woman who had loved him through everything. The ring had never left his finger, not through to tours of duty in Korea, not through decades of hard work, not even during Margaret's long illness when money had been so tight. With hands that shook like autumn leaves, Thomas slowly twisted the ring off his finger. The metal felt warm against his palm. He placed it gently on the counter, the small golden circle looking tiny and insignificant against the dark surface. Would this cover the difference? He asked quietly, his voice barely audible above the morning noise of the cafe. The silence that followed was deafening. Conversations died completely. Even the businessman stopped tapping his foot. This was a man who had served his country with honor, who had faced enemy fire and saved the lives of fellow soldiers, now reduced to trading his most treasured possession for a simple meal of tea and toast. Emma Watson stood behind the coffee machine, her heart breaking as she watched the painful scene unfold at the counter. The 19-year-old university student had been working part-time at Riverside Cafe for 8 months. To help pay for her studies, she had seen many different customers come and go, but something about this elderly gentleman made her chest tighten with emotion. She noticed the small purple heart medal pinned carefully to Thomas's faded jacket, right next to other military decorations that spoke of service and sacrifice. Emma's own grandfather had worn similar medals, and she recognized the quiet dignity that seemed to surround men who had given so much to their country. There was something in Thomas's posture, even bent with age and embarrassment, that reminded her of the stories her grandfather used to tell about honor and duty. Her grandfather had been a soldier too, serving in World War II before she was born. He had passed away when Emma was 12, but she still remembered his gentle voice telling her stories about the importance of looking after fellow soldiers. We take care of our own, he used to say, his eyes growing distant as he remembered friends from long ago. A soldier never leaves another soldier behind, not even in peacetime. Emma watched as Thomas's shaking hands removed his wedding ring, and she felt tears stinging her own eyes. She knew that look on his face, the mixture of pride and desperation that comes when life becomes too heavy to bear alone. It was the same expression she had seen on her grandfather's face during his final years when his pension barely covered his medication, and he was too proud to ask for help. The businessman behind Thomas continued to mutter complaints about being late, completely unaware that he was witnessing a man's dignity being stripped away piece by piece. Other customers had begun to stare, some with curiosity, others with the uncomfortable embarrassment that comes from watching someone else's private pain. Thomas began to gather his things. His movements slow and defeated, he picked up his wallet and started to turn away from the counter, leaving his wedding ring sitting there like a small golden sacrifice. Emma could see that he was about to walk out of the cafe without his breakfast, too ashamed to stay any longer. Wait, please don't leave, Emma called softly across the busy cafe, her voice cutting through the morning chatter. She moved quickly from behind the coffee machine, wiping her hands on her apron. Her tip jar sat on the counter near the till, a small glass container filled with coins and the occasional pound note from generous customers. Emma had been saving those tips for weeks to buy textbooks for the new university term. But seeing Thomas's situation made her decision instant and clear. Without hesitation, she reached into the jar and pulled out the exact amount needed. The coins felt warm in her palm as she placed them on the counter next to the till, the metal making small clicking sounds against the surface. "Your breakfast is paid for, sir," Emma said gently, her voice warm with genuine kindness. "Please Sit and enjoy your meal." Thomas looked up at her with surprise and confusion. His withered eyes, lined with years of both joy and sorrow, began to fill with tears. The kindness of this young stranger seemed to overwhelm him, and for a moment he could not find words to respond. "You don't have to do that, love," Thomas finally managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll manage somehow. I always do." But Emma was already moving round the counter, gently taking Thomas's arm and guiding him toward a quiet table near the window. The morning sun streamed through the glass, creating warm patches of light on the wooden surface. "My grandfather was in the army too," Emma said softly as she helped Thomas into his chair. "He always said soldiers look after each other, even long after the war ends." Thomas carefully picked up his wedding ring from the counter and slipped it back onto his finger where it belonged. The relief on his face was visible as the precious symbol of his love for Margaret returned to its rightful place. As Emma brought his tea and toast to the table, Thomas found himself opening up to this kind young woman who had shown him such unexpected compassion. The words came slowly at first, then faster as he realized how desperately he needed someone to listen. He told her about his beloved wife, Margaret, who had passed away 6 months ago after a long battle with cancer. The medical bills from her treatment had eaten through their small savings account. He explained how he was a Korean War veteran, living alone now in a tiny flat, trying to make his small pension stretch to cover rent. "Medicine and food. Some days are harder than others," Thomas admitted, stirring sugar into his tea with a spoon that rattled slightly against the cup. "Margaret always handled the money. She was so much better at making things work. I feel lost without her guidance." Emma listened with her whole heart, occasionally nodding or making soft sounds of understanding. She could see the loneliness in Thomas's eyes, the weight of grief that seemed to press down on his shoulders. Her grandfather had experienced similar struggles, and she remembered how much it had meant to him when people took time to really listen as Thomas talked. Emma knew with growing certainty that she had to do something more to help this honorable man who had given so much to his country and was now facing his golden years alone and struggling. During her afternoon break, Emma walked over to the community notice board that hung on the wall near the cafe's entrance. The cork board was covered with colorful flyers advertising everything from guitar lessons to Lost Cats, but she remembered seeing something specific that might help Thomas. Her eyes scanned the various notices until she found what she was looking for, a small white card with bold black letters that read Riverside Veterans Support Group. Weekly meetings every Thursday, 7 p.m. All veterans welcome. For information, call James Harrison. Below the text was a phone number written in neat handwriting. Emma carefully wrote down the number on a napkin, her hand shaking slightly with nervous energy. She had never done anything like this before, but something deep in her heart told her it was the right thing to do. Her grandfather's voice seemed to echo in her memory, reminding her about the importance of soldiers looking after each other. The staff room at the back of the cafe was quiet and empty during the busy lunch hour. Emma sat on an old plastic chair next to a small table covered with employee schedules and health safety posters. She pulled out her mobile phone and stared at the number she had written down. Taking a deep breath before dialing, the phone rang. 3 times before a warm, strong voice answered. "Hello, Veteran Support Group. This is James speaking." Emma's heart began to beat faster, now that someone had actually answered. She felt suddenly uncertain about what to say. How do you explain to a stranger that you have found someone who might need help? "Hello," Emma began, her voice slightly shaky. "My name is Emma. I'm calling about a veteran who I think needs help. His name is Thomas Mitchell, and he was just in our cafe this morning." "Thomas Mitchell," James interrupted, his voice suddenly becoming urgent and excited. "Are you absolutely sure about the name?" Thomas Mitchell. Older gentleman, probably wearing military pins. Emma was surprised by the immediate reaction. "Yes." "That's him exactly. He had medals on his jacket and wore an old army cap. Do you know him?" "Know him?" James's voice grew louder with emotion. "We've been looking for him for months. He used to come to our weekly meetings regularly. But he stopped showing up after his wife died earlier this year. We've been worried. Sick about him. Where is he now? Is he all right?" Emma felt a surge of relief knowing that Thomas had people who cared about him. She began to explain everything that had happened that morning. How Thomas had been 30 pence short for his breakfast, the cruel comments from the businessman, and how he had tried to trade his wedding ring to pay for his simple meal. He seemed so alone and embarrassed. Emma continued. "He told me his wife Margaret passed away 6 months ago, and he's been struggling with medical bills and living on just his pension. I paid for his breakfast. But I could see he needs much more help than I can give him." As Emma spoke, she could hear James talking to other people in the background. Voices became animated with concern and determination. She heard someone say Thomas Mitchell and another voice responding with what sounded like "Finally found him, and we need to get there right away." "Emma, you have no idea how important this phone call is," James said, his voice filled with gratitude and urgency. "Thomas Mitchell is a hero. He served tours of duty in Korea and saved the lives of several men in his unit. He earned his Purple Heart Medal defending Hill 355 during one of the bloodiest battles of the war." Emma felt her chest swell with pride for Thomas. Even though she barely knew him, the quiet, dignified man who had sat in their cafe that morning was truly someone special after his wife died. "Thomas just disappeared from our group," James continued. "We tried calling his home phone, but it was disconnected. We went to his old address, but the neighbors said he had moved. We've been searching for him because we knew he would be struggling alone. And we were right." Emma could hear the emotion in James's voice, and it made her feel even more certain that she had done the right thing by calling. "We have resources to help him," James explained. "Our group has an emergency fund specifically for situations like this. We help veterans with rent, medical bills, food, whatever they need. Thomas is family to us, and we never leave family behind. But I don't know if he'll want a fuss made over him." Emma worried aloud. "He seemed very proud, and I think he might be embarrassed if he knows I called for help." James's voice became gentle and reassuring. "Trust me, dear. I've been working with veterans for over 20 years. Sometimes the proudest soldiers are the ones who need the most reminding that they're not forgotten. Thomas served his country with honor, and now it's our turn to serve him." Emma could hear rustling sounds and multiple voices in the background as James spoke to his group members. "We're gathering the team right now," James said with determination. "We'll be there in 20 minutes. Thank you for caring enough to make this call. Emma, you may have just saved Thomas's life." Emma hung up the phone, her heart beating fast with anticipation and nervous excitement. She had no idea exactly what would happen when the veterans group arrived, but she felt deep in her heart that something wonderful and healing was about to unfold in their small cafe. 20 minutes later, the familiar chime of the cafe door began to ring repeatedly as people entered one after another. Emma looked up from behind the counter, her heart racing with nervous anticipation. She watched as the first man walked through the door, a tall, broad-shouldered gentleman in his 60s with silver hair and kind eyes. He wore a navy blue jacket with several military pins ranged neatly on the chest. This was clearly James Harrison, the group leader she had spoken to. On the phone, his presence commanded quiet respect. And there was something about the way he carried himself that reminded Emma of her grandfather, that unmistakable bearing of someone who had served in the military. Following James, more people entered the cafe in a steady stream. Emma counted 15 members of the Riverside Veterans Group as they filed in through the doorway. There was Mary Campbell, a woman in her 70s with grey hair pulled back in a neat bun and wearing a jacket with Nurse Corps insignia. Behind her came Robert Davies, a man about Thomas's age who walked with the help of a polished wooden walking stick, but held his head high with dignity. Others followed, men and women of different ages, some using walking sticks, others moving, slowly but with purpose. 2 members arrived in wheelchairs, pushed by fellow veterans who treated them with the utmost care and respect. Despite their various physical challenges, every single person wore their service badges with quiet pride, small metal pins that caught the afternoon light and told stories of sacrifice and honor. The busy afternoon crowd in the cafe began to notice the unusual gathering. Conversations grew quieter as customers turned to watch this group of veterans moving through the space with obvious purpose and determination. There was something powerful about seeing so many people who had served their country gathered together in one place. Thomas looked up from his cup of tea, which had grown cold as he sat lost in memories of Margaret. His weathered eyes widened with surprise and recognition as he saw familiar faces from months past. These were people he had once shared stories with, laughed with, and found comfort with during the dark days of Margaret's illness. James Harrison approached Thomas's table with slow, respectful steps. His voice carried clearly across the now silent cafe as he spoke with formal military courtesy. "Sergeant Thomas Mitchell," James said, standing straight and tall beside the small table. "You've been missed, my friend." The busy cafe fell completely silent. Even the espresso machine seemed to quiet its usual hissing and bubbling sounds. Customers stopped their conversations mid-sentence. The businessman who had complained earlier that morning about Thomas holding up the line stopped checking his phone and looked up with growing awareness. Thomas tried to push his chair back and stand up, his instincts telling him to show proper respect to his fellow veterans. But gentle hands from several directions kept him seated. These people had not come to make him feel more embarrassed or ashamed. They had come to surround him with love and support. James's voice grew stronger as he addressed not just Thomas, but everyone in the cafe who was watching this remarkable scene unfold. "Thomas served his country with extraordinary courage," James announced, his words carrying to every corner of the room. "He fought in the Korean War, and the Purple Heart Medal, and saved the lives of 3 fellow soldiers during the Battle of Hill 355. This man is a hero." Emma felt tears forming in her eyes as she watched from behind the counter. She had known Thomas was special, but hearing about his specific acts of bravery made her chest swell with even more respect for the quiet gentleman who had simply wanted tea and toast that morning. Mary Campbell, the former army nurse, pulled up a chair and sat directly beside Thomas. Her movements were gentle but purposeful as she reached over and took his weathered hand in both of hers. Her touch was warm and comforting, like a mother or sister offering comfort to someone in pain. "We should have found you sooner," Mary said softly, her voice filled with regret and compassion. "No veteran should face hard times alone. We're family, Thomas, and family looks after each other." The businessman who had been so impatient and rude that morning pushed through the small crowd of onlookers. His expensive suit and polished shoes seemed less impressive now as he approached Thomas's table with obvious shame written across his face. "Sir," the businessman said, his voice shaking slightly with emotion, "I owe you an apology. And much more than that. I had no idea who you were or what you had done for our country. My behavior this morning was inexcusable." Thomas looked round at all the faces surrounding him, faces full of understanding, respect, and unconditional support. Some were lined with age, others marked with scars from old injuries. But all showed the same expression of genuine care and brotherhood. For the first time in the 6 months since Margaret's death, Thomas felt like he belonged somewhere again. The loneliness that had been crushing his spirit began to lift as he realized he was not forgotten. After all, these people, his fellow veterans, had been searching for him, worrying about him, and planning to help him. The shame and embarrassment from that morning's incident seemed to fade away as he was surrounded by people who truly understood what he had been through and what he was facing now. What happened next transformed not just Thomas's life, but the entire atmosphere of the cafe. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the large windows seemed brighter somehow, casting warm golden patches across the tables where this remarkable gathering was taking place. The veterans didn't simply offer to pay for Thomas's meal. They began creating a complete support network right there on the spot. James Harrison pulled up a chair and sat directly across from Thomas, opening a small notebook that he carried in his jacket pocket. His voice was calm and reassuring as he began to explain the resources available through their veterans group. "Thomas, our group has an emergency fund that was created specifically for situations exactly like this," James said, his words carrying the weight of genuine commitment. "We've been saving money from fundraising events, donations from the community, and contributions from our own members. Your bills will be covered while we help you get back on your feet properly." Thomas opened his mouth to protest. The same pride that had nearly made him trade his wedding ring for a breakfast still strong within him. But James held up a gentle hand to stop any objections. "This isn't charity, my friend," James continued. "This is what we do for a family. You served your country with honor. And now it's our turn to serve you." Mary Campbell, still holding Thomas's weathered hand, leaned forward with a warm smile that reminded him so much of Margaret's caring nature. "I live just 10 minutes away from here, Thomas. I love to cook, and my kitchen always makes too much food for just one person. I'd like to bring you home-cooked meals twice a week, proper meals with vegetables and meat. Not just tea and toast, Robert." Davies, leaning on his polished walking stick, nodded enthusiastically. "And I live in the Riverside Gardens area too. My old car doesn't get much use these days. So I'd be happy to drive you to medical appointments, grocery shopping, or anywhere else you need to go. We can't have you walking everywhere in this cold weather." More voices joined in as other veterans began offering their own forms of support. A younger veteran named David Wilson offered to help with any home repairs that might be needed. Susan Clark, who had served as a military clerk, volunteered to help Thomas organize his finances and make sure he was receiving all the benefits he was entitled to as a veteran. "I can come by once a week just for companionship," offered Patricia Brown, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes. "We can play cards, watch old movies, or just talk. Margaret sounds like she was a wonderful woman, and I'd love to hear more stories about her." Mrs. Peterson, the cafe owner, had been watching this incredible display of community support from behind the counter. She was a woman in her 50s who had run the Riverside Cafe for over 20 years, and she had seen many things happen in her establishment, but nothing quite like this. Unable to contain her emotions any longer, Mrs. Peterson stepped forward and made her own announcement to the gathered crowd. "Thomas," she said, her voice slightly shaky with emotion, "you will eat here free every Tuesday morning from now on, the same day you used to come with Margaret. It would be my honor to provide that for you." The businessman who had been so rude and impatient that morning, had been standing quietly at the edge of the group, listening to every word with growing amazement and shame. Finally, he approached James privately, tapping him gently on the shoulder. "Excuse me," the businessman said quietly, his earlier arrogance completely gone. "I need to speak with you about something important. I had no idea what kind of man I was speaking to this morning. I was inexcusably rude to a hero, and I want to make it right. How can I contribute to your Veterans Fund?" James looked at the businessman with surprise and growing respect. "What's your name?" "Sir, Michael Stevens," the man replied. "I run a small accounting firm here in town. I'd like to make a significant donation to your emergency fund, and I'd also like to offer my services free of charge to help Thomas with his financial planning and tax preparation." Emma watched all of this unfold from her position behind the coffee counter, tears of joy streaming down her cheeks. Her small act of kindness that morning, paying 30 pence for a stranger's breakfast, had created ripples of connection and healing that were spreading throughout the entire community. She could hardly believe what she was witnessing. Thomas slowly straightened his shoulders as he looked round at all the caring faces surrounding him. With deliberate, dignified movements, he picked up his old army cap from the table and placed it back on his head with renewed pride. His voice grew stronger and clearer than it had been in months. "Margaret always said that kindness comes back to you when you need it most," Thomas said, his words carrying clearly across the quiet cafe. "I thought I was completely alone in this world. But I can see now that family isn't always about blood relations. Sometimes it's about people who truly understand your heart and what you've been through." As the afternoon continued, Thomas found himself surrounded by laughter, shared stories of military service, and the warmest feeling he had experienced since Margaret's passing 6 months ago. He was no longer just surviving day by day. He was truly living again, supported by a community that valued his service and cherished his presence among them. The end.